going to be talking on a very particular experience called samādhi, which is, well, some of this stuff some people will know a lot about it, some people won't know a lot about it, so I'm going to fill in some gaps. And my interest is in this yogic state of samādhi and actually what it is. There's in the psychedelic world in general, all sorts of interesting topics being discussed throughout the conference, but this is what interests me is actually enlightenment, and it's not often mentioned. and then that was what took me into the whole psychedelic thing in the first place. This sort of interest in what that actually was. Now, there are many ways to describe non-ordinary experiences. There's just a vast literature on non-ordinary experiences of all sorts. I had a go in this particular book to just categorize in very, very, very general way non-ordinary experiences. There's so many ways of doing it, and there's so much literature, so it's just a surface overview. But mystical experiences, and people have talked about this before, classically William James classified mystical experiences in a certain way. And then this is based, and then more recently surveys on mystical experiences. Have you ever been aware of it? So on and so on. There's indigenous spirit possession, which is, as somebody mentioned in the conference, is remarkably common in many, many cultures. All these categories, they're not fixed categories. There's a sort of seamless boundary between these areas, but it's just to sort of get a handle on what non-ordinary experiences comprise. Then, of course, there's hypnosis. I'm going to talk a little bit more about that later. In fact, the term was coined by a chap called James Braid in the middle of the 19th century. And I'm going to be talking about his very interesting studies in due course. And then there's a contemporary medical way of looking. I say contemporary medical, again, it's a very shorthand way of describing a complex situation, of describing non-ordinary states of consciousness. And there's a quote there: anybody who reports just 2 of the 8 classic symptoms of religious experience is classified as having a disorder. So then mystical experiences, Walter Stace famously, this scheme again, ineffability, paradoxicality, and so on, mystical experience. Then, just lastly, Ralph Metzner, he had a very useful scheme to describe the effects of substances on the person in terms of high arousal and then pleasure and pain. And you'll see in that scheme you've got absorption and trance there, just near the bottom on the right-hand side, as just one of the states of consciousness that you can experience. Now, in the Upanishads, which are these texts, semi-philosophical texts attached to the Veda, which is the oldest scriptures in India, there are several references to a state called Turiya, the 4th state. There's a quote there from one of the Upanishads. I won't read it all out. You can have a quick look at all that. And the Turiya state, it's a very simple scheme where you've got waking, dreaming, and sleeping. And Turiya, this 4th state, is said to be nothing like nothing like waking, nothing like dreaming, nothing like sleeping. It's a distinctive kind of state. And when we move on from the Upanishads to Patanjali, famously associated with the eightfold scheme of yoga, we have as the highest goal, if you like, at the top of the tree, the aim is for samādhi, a trance state. Essentially, he describes 2 kinds of trance states. One where there's no movement, no cognition, nothing happening in the mind at all. And then there's another kind of state where there's still something going on, a little bit. Putting it simply, it's much more technical than that, but that's the sort of fundamental scheme of the thing. Then, similarly in the Buddhist world, that kind of state, in some Buddhist fields, some Buddhist branches, they have 4 jhanas, in some 8, in some 8 plus 1 or 9 jhanas, but essentially the same when you get to cessation, number 9. Again, like everything stops. This is the condition that you can arrive in if you're a successful meditator. Then, just to mention that this is a plug. I'm an editor, well, managing editor of this journal, Journal of Yoga Studies. We've published like 5 volumes. We're on number 6 at the moment. And we get some very interesting submissions. And in this in the world of yoga, in this looking at the samadhi state, essentially there have been a few very interesting articles looking at yogis or looking for the purpose of the journal, it's looking at texts where what is described as about this state is how this state is as like death. There's no detectable breath, there's no detectable pulse, and the person appears as if dead. And this state can continue for a long period of time, it seems, in some cases, before the person comes back, if they do come back even. And this is just to illustrate how in the Tantric world in particular, there's this idea that the energetic force, to put things simply, when you're entering into this non-dual samadhi state, where the energy rises through the body. Now at the top of the head there's a place called the Brahmarandra, this hole, and 12 fingers above that is the place where whatever energy is in the body, it rises out, and it rises out through the top of the head through this hole, and then there's a kind of meeting of two kinds of energies, to put it simply, and then the body is, as it were, abandoned, and you're in this kind of state, this samadhi state. Accompanying this state is often this practice of Kichari Mudra, which can occur spontaneously in people. And it's just a little diagram to show how what happens is that the tongue curls back in the mouth, and above the palate, at the top of the mouth, there's a gap. And the tongue, if it's long enough, in fact, what yogis do sometimes is they wrap a cloth around their tongue and they pull it and pull it and pull it over a long period of time to make it long enough so that it curls around, as you can see in that diagram, in the last final stage, it curls around and goes into this gap above the palate, Kichari Mudra. And it means movement in space. And this particular movement of the tongue inside the mouth can be practiced, but also in some people it happens spontaneously. This thing happens. In fact, I just read recently a report of how African slaves who were being transported across the Atlantic, when they were severely disturbed and felt they were being tortured, sometimes they would be able to do this to themselves, just put their tongue into this gap and commit suicide, just stop their breathing. So this, in fact, there's been a lot of work on Kichari Mudra, but this is the practice that sometimes accompanies, or this is the situation that happens when sometimes people are entering this state and they get this spontaneous Kichari Mudra experience, or they practice it deliberately, and so on. Now, here's just a quote on Kichari Mudra. You can read that. Took a few deep breaths, performed the Kichari Mudra. The forcibly stops the breathing process and concentrating on the center between the eyebrows, shock off his body. Now, when we're talking about this practice, of course, this is described in text, how yogis stop breathing. They become, as I mentioned before, like a piece of wood, as though they're as if dead. But there are also quite a number of interesting examples of relatively recent examples of people who've attained this samadhi state, well-documented cases. This is famously Ramakrishna, the Bengali mystic who lived in the end of the 19th century in Calcutta. And after a long series of adventures with all sorts of people and practices, he went into the samadhi state, and he was in it for 6 months. He was in it for 6 months. His body, after he attained that state, was put in a room, and he described how afterwards, he was not aware of night or day, that when there were flies buzzing around his nostrils, he had no idea, he was just completely gone. He was in that state for 6 months. Eventually, one of his devotees he wanted him to come back, put some food in his mouth, and that movement caused him to return to the body. And he wasn't very happy about returning because he's having a rather nice time there in heaven. And here he's just not in a full samadhi state, but in a state of ecstasy. It was called samadhi, but there are actually actually sort of degrees of this condition, which I'm going to explore in a second. Another relatively recent example, Ramana Maharshi, he also describes there's a recent biography of him, again, similarly how he entered this state where he thought he died and there was no detectable breath. He was just completely gone, as it were. Now, I mentioned earlier this chap, James Braid, and this is a rather interesting little publication. James Braid coined the term hypnotism. This is around 1840. He was a very high-profile figure at the time, talking here and there. And he also did work on medical problems with hypnosis, treating people all over the place, hypnotizing them and getting rid of pains and diseases and all sorts of things. There's also, in this particular book, there's some very interesting accounts of observations in India of yogis. And the most detailed account I'll just tell you about in some detail to explain the situation. There was a yogi who was in what is now Pakistan, in Lahore. And this is all going on in the 1840s. And this yogi said, yes, I can put myself in samadhi. So this is very interesting. So a substantial team was assembled with several doctors, surgeons, medical people, and a large crowd of people, including the Nizam of Lahore, who ride on an elephant to watch the whole thing. And the yogi, he does pranayama. He does excessive breathing for some period of time. Then the eyes roll into the top of his head. He is as if dead. He's put inside a cloth bag. That's put inside a box. Before he went into the trance, he was asked, "Yeah, how long do you want to be in that trance for?" And he said, 40 days. Wake me up after 40 days. So then they put this box inside a cave. They sealed the cave with a padlock. They got sentries on duty, 24 hours a day, 2 sentries in rotation, night and day, just to make sure nobody goes near him, nothing going on there. No cheating, in other words. Now, there are yogis who cheat. Some of them make a living pretending they can do this, but that's certainly a case, certainly a factor in some of the cases. But some of these documented cases, yeah, there was no cheating going on. So after 40 days, they bring the yogi out of the cave. 3 doctors examine him. There's no detectable pulse. There's no detectable breath. He is as if dead. They get thinner when they're in this state, and then the team has spent about half an hour massaging his body. They put hot towels on his head. His teeth were clamped shut. This is one of the things that happens. They forced his teeth open and they put some ghee on his tongue. They made it go down his throat. Then after about half an hour, he twitched, and then he was back again. And then a bit, like groggy a bit, if you can say, but he's not too bad. And then after some time, he's fully functional and he's back again. And he could do this at will. And there are cases of yogis who can do this at will. And the interesting thing about this is that, to me, is that this particular experience, this samadhi experience, is completely undocumented in current medical science. Nobody knows about this trance state. Now, James Braid, he called this human hibernation. And it's well known that animals like marmots can go into hibernation. Their pulse goes down to, in fact, it's about a tenth of, the pulse goes down to about a tenth of normal, breathing goes down to a 30th of normal. It's virtually undetectable. The vital functions don't completely stop, but they get completely reduced in this hibernation state. And as far as James Braid was concerned, this is human hibernation, this particular trance state. In this state, it's impossible for people to describe, as we know, almost impossible to describe, but the white light of the Godhead is one of the you could say, one of the general sort of categories you could put this in. That's what people experience in that state. It's the enlightenment state. There are also stories, and it's impossible to verify, but when I was in India in the 80s, there was a yogi who was in Andhra Pradesh, and he'd been in a shrine at a temple for years. And just one day of the year, the temple doors would open, people would file past, and he was just sitting there, very long nails, long hair, in trance, and just like sitting there as if dead. And then after a particular round of viewing on the Shivaratri night, some months later, the pujaris, the priests, they smelt a bad smell, and he just quit his body. He'd just gone, you know. So, and he'd actually died. But for years, he'd been just sitting there in this trance state. And it's all about breathing. This is the key point. The whole thing is about breathing. And the samadhi state, it starts when breathing slows down. And my own experience of this, and I've talked to many friends who've had this experience, that if you're very high, particularly on tryptamines, you start entering in this samadhi state where your breathing slows down, and you're just so happy that you can't even be bothered to breathe. You know, but the deeper you go into this, you know, if you go completely deep, eventually the breathing stops. Anecdotally, this is only anecdotally, but that you need to stop for about 13 seconds. The breathing stops at 13 seconds, then you really start entering this animal or human hibernation state. Now, there have been a lot of very interesting studies published recently on people doing meditation, particularly in the jhana meditation and also other forms of meditation. And it's been noticed in some of the studies how people do stop breathing, but like for 8 seconds or 9 seconds or 10 seconds or 12 seconds like this, just below the threshold where you really actually go into the hibernation state. So it's known that deep meditation states have this. One of the observable things is that people's breath slows down and actually stops. And just on the as a corollary of all this, if people are familiar with yoga and Patanjali, the 8 steps of yoga, or the 8 limbs of yoga rather, pranayama is associated in modern practices with deep breathing and lots of different kinds of pranayama, deep breathing. And then some people say, well, Patanjali, he wasn't talking about deep breathing, he was just talking about sort of evenly breathing, you know, just evenly breathing. Actually, if you look at the text, the Sanskrit word used is vicheda. He's talking about pranayama means actually stopping breathing. But this is the sort of thing that people gloss over. Well, he surely doesn't mean actually stopping breathing. He's just doing pranayama. He's not actually, don't stop completely. No, you do stop completely. And that, I believe, is what he's talking about, this complete cessation of breath where people enter into this trance state. And one of the hopes from giving this little talk is that I'm curious to collect any sort of data that people have on this non-breathing state. Certainly, as I mentioned earlier, I've had this experience, other friends have had this experience, and as far as I'm aware, I've not come across this phenomenon on psychedelics. It's only with tryptamines. It's 5-MeO. Talk to people with 5-MeO who've had this experience, and with DMT, and also with ayahuasca and with LSD, but not with any other substances. Now, I just don't know. Maybe people have had this same experience on phenethylamines or other kinds of substances, but I just don't know. But as I say, there's nothing published on this in the sort of modern medical science, and this state of human hibernation at the moment up to this point has just been associated with animals and not with humans. But I've become convinced that that actually is what these, when we're talking about, particularly in the Asian world and particularly Indian world, when people are talking about enlightenment, this is the state they're talking about, this non-breathing condition. So there we are. Thank you.